David Martinez is a middle-aged man, born and raised in the small, serene town of Maple Creek. With soft brown eyes, graying hair at his temples, and the kind of smile that made him seem approachable, David was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. Maple Creek had always been home, a town nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, a place where everyone knew each other by name. The town prided itself on its tight-knit community and peaceful way of life. David, much like the town itself, was predictable in his routines, a man of few words, but a dependable figure in the community. David worked as a mechanic, running the local auto repair shop that had been passed down to him from his father. The shop sat on the corner of Main Street, the heart of Maple Creek, where every passing car and pedestrian would wave or honk in recognition. His days were filled with the familiar smell of oil, the hum of engines, and the friendly banter with longtime customers. He knew every car by sound, every engine problem by instinct. He lived a life that many would describe as content, though at times, even David felt the quiet loneliness that comes with routine. David was the kind of person who liked the simple pleasures of life. Every morning before heading to the shop, he would take a walk through the town square, grab a cup of coffee from Judy's Cafe, and exchange pleasantries with other early risers. He had a modest house at the edge of town, where he lived alone. His children, now grown, had moved to the city to chase their dreams, and his wife, Mary, had passed away years earlier, leaving him to fill the quiet void of his home with work. While David never complained, his days often felt repetitive, the rhythms of life in Maple Creek never changing much. But there was comfort in that. Maple Creek was a place where life moved at a leisurely pace, the kind of town where nothing particularly exciting ever happened, and that was exactly how its residents liked it. The town was picturesque, with tree-lined streets, neatly kept lawns, and flower boxes hanging from the windows of quaint shops that lined the main road. Maple Creek was the sort of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors dropped by unannounced, and where the biggest news of the day might be Mrs. Jenkins winning a pie-baking contest, or the occasional deer spotted wandering too close to town. But there was one thing about Maple Creek that was less than idyllic: the weather. The town sat in a peculiar geographic area prone to sudden changes in climate. Summers were warm and pleasant, but the transition seasons, spring and fall, were unpredictable. Storms would roll in out of nowhere, often without warning, catching even the most seasoned locals off guard. The skies could go from bright and sunny to dark and ominous in a matter of minutes. Most of the time, these storms were harmless, short bursts of rain and wind that would pass just as quickly as they came, but once in a while, the weather turned violent, reminding everyone of the untamable force of nature. Despite the occasional storm, Maple Creek was a place where routine reigned supreme, where life rarely deviated from the norm. That was why, on that particular afternoon, when dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, no one paid much attention. To the residents, including David, it was just another day. Until it wasn't. It started like any other day for David. He arrived at the mechanic shop early, as he always did, the morning light casting a golden hue over the town. The air was crisp, with the promise of autumn in the breeze. He greeted his two employees, Mike and Terry, who had been with him for years. The three men fell into their usual rhythm, fixing cars and chatting about local gossip, who was dating who, whose kid had just started school, and how the Maple Creek football team was faring this season. The first half of the day passed uneventfully. David had just finished repairing Mrs. Henderson's old Buick and was wiping his hands clean of oil when he noticed something strange. He glanced outside the large garage window and saw that the sky had started to change. It had been clear and bright all morning, but now dark clouds were rolling in quickly from the west. They looked heavy, almost too dark for a normal storm. A gust of wind rattled the trees outside the shop, scattering leaves across the parking lot. David felt a sudden unease, but he brushed it aside. Storms were nothing new to Maple Creek. He'd lived through dozens of them. The locals had learned to adapt, hunkering down when the weather turned bad, waiting it out until the skies cleared again. Still, there was something about the way those clouds moved, almost like they were creeping in faster than they should. He looked at Mike, who was peering out the window as well. "Looks like we might get a little wet on the way home tonight," Mike said with a chuckle, clearly not too concerned. David nodded but kept his eyes on the sky. Something about this storm felt different. As the afternoon wore on, the storm clouds thickened, casting an eerie shadow over the town. The wind had picked up, causing the trees outside to sway violently. David's instincts told him this wasn't just a passing shower. He made the decision to close the shop early, just in case. "Let's pack it up for the day," he told his employees. "Better safe than sorry." As they locked up the shop, David couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just a storm was brewing. On his drive home, the wind howled, and the first drops of rain began to splatter on the windshield. David took a detour through the town square, a habit of his whenever he wanted to clear his head. The square was usually bustling with activity during the day, but now, with the storm coming, it was almost deserted. Shops were closing early, and people were rushing to get indoors before the worst of the weather hit. That's when he saw him, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Arthur Lewis was a familiar but distant figure in Maple Creek. He was an elderly man, somewhere in his late 70s, with a slow, deliberate gait aided by a worn-out cane. Most people in town didn't know much about him, except that he lived alone in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts. He rarely spoke, keeping to himself as he made his daily rounds to the town square. Every afternoon, he would sit on the same bench, feeding the birds with crumbs from his pockets, as if locked in his own world of routine and solitude. David had seen him many times before, but they had never exchanged more than a few polite nods. Mr. Lewis was a quiet man, his life seemingly invisible to most. But there was something about his presence, something that always struck David as sad, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The man seemed like a relic of a forgotten past, someone whose story had long faded from the collective memory of the town. Today, however, was different. As David drove by, he saw Mr. Lewis standing in the square, staring up at the darkening sky, as if oblivious to the storm gathering around him. The old man seemed fragile, like a lone figure waiting for something, perhaps someone. His cane trembled slightly in his hand, and David noticed that he wasn't moving to seek shelter. It struck David as odd that Mr. Lewis, of all people, was still outside when everyone else had already retreated indoors. David slowed the truck and watched for a moment, debating whether or not he should stop. Mr. Lewis didn't seem to be in distress, but there was something about the sight of the old man standing alone in the storm that made David uneasy. As the first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, David made up his mind. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the rising wind, unaware that this decision would soon change everything. The moment David stepped out of his truck, he felt the full weight of the storm pressing down on him. The wind had picked up so fiercely that it was difficult to walk straight, and the rain, which had started as a light drizzle, now came down in thick sheets, blurring the world around him. The town square, normally so familiar and peaceful, had transformed into a scene of chaos. The sky, once just ominous, now churned with angry clouds, dark as night, and the air was thick with electricity. Maple Creek had experienced storms before, but this one felt different, more menacing, more unpredictable. David pulled his coat tighter around himself as he crossed the street toward the bench, where Mr. Lewis stood, still gazing up at the sky, as if he didn't notice the chaos descending on the town. In that moment, David couldn't understand why Mr. Lewis wasn't seeking shelter like everyone else. The streets were empty, stores had locked up, and even the birds Mr. Lewis used to feed had disappeared. It was as though the storm had sucked the life out of the town, leaving only this fragile old man standing in its wake. Suddenly, without warning, the power across town went out. Streetlights flickered once, then died, leaving the town square bathed in an eerie half-light. The only illumination came from occasional flashes of lightning that ripped across the sky, followed by deafening rolls of thunder. In the distance, David could hear car alarms going off, triggered by the sudden blackout. He glanced at the surrounding buildings, now darkened and abandoned, and felt a rising sense of urgency. The storm wasn't just passing through, it was here to stay. And it was getting worse by the second. As David neared the bench, he called out to Mr. Lewis, but the wind swallowed his voice. The old man didn't turn, didn't flinch. His frail figure stood unmoving, his back to David, as if he was lost in thought, unaware of the danger gathering around him. David quickened his pace, his boots splashing through the deepening puddles on the pavement, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and frustration. He had to get Mr. Lewis out of the storm before it was too late. Just as David reached the bench, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the square, knocking over trash cans and sending debris skittering across the ground. Mr. Lewis, unsteady on his feet, stumbled forward and fell to the ground with a heavy thud. David's stomach lurched. The old man lay still, his cane rolling away from him as the rain pummeled down, soaking his thin coat. In an instant, David knew he had to act. David rushed forward, sliding to his knees beside Mr. Lewis. The wind howled around them, making it almost impossible to see or hear anything. He called out the old man's name, shaking his shoulder gently at first, then more urgently when Mr. Lewis didn't respond right away. "Mr. Lewis, Mr. Lewis, can you hear me?" The old man stirred, groaning softly as he struggled to push himself up with weak arms. His face was pale, and his breathing labored. David could see that Mr. Lewis was in no shape to move on his own, and the storm was only getting worse. The rain lashed at their faces, and David could feel the chill seeping into his bones, but none of that mattered right now. He had a choice to make: leave Mr. Lewis to fend for himself and find shelter, or try to help him, risking both of their safety in the process. David hesitated for only a moment before his conscience made the decision for him. There was no way he could leave Mr. Lewis behind, not like this. Not when the old man clearly needed help. With the storm growing fiercer by the second, David knew they didn't have much time to find shelter before things went from bad to worse. Grabbing Mr. Lewis by the arm, David hoisted the frail man to his feet. Mr. Lewis swayed dangerously, barely able to stand, and David had to throw one arm around his waist to keep him upright. The old man's weight, slight as it was, felt heavy against David's side, but he gritted his teeth and prepared for the hard task ahead. "We have to get out of here, Mr. Lewis," David shouted over the wind, though he wasn't sure if the old man could hear him. "Come on, I'll help you." Mr. Lewis nodded weakly, his head bobbing up and down, though his eyes remained dazed, his mind seemingly elsewhere. David tightened his grip and began moving toward the nearest building, an old hardware store across the street. It wasn't far, but with the storm raging around them, it felt like miles. As they began to move, the full force of the storm hit them head-on. The wind was relentless, pushing against them with such strength that each step felt like a battle. Trees bent and groaned under the strain, their branches snapping and flying through the air like missiles. Rain lashed at their faces, making it almost impossible to see. David's feet slipped on the wet pavement, and he had to steady both himself and Mr. Lewis more than once as they trudged toward safety. The old man was barely conscious, his legs dragging behind him as David did most of the work. Every few steps, David had to stop to readjust his grip and make sure Mr. Lewis was still with him. He could feel the old man's heartbeat, faint but steady, against his side. It was clear that Mr. Lewis was in worse shape than David had initially thought, and with every passing second, the storm grew more dangerous. As they made their way across the town square, the wind howled louder, and David could hear the sharp crack of trees being uprooted in the distance. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the sky, casting everything in an otherworldly white light. For a brief moment, David could see the destruction unfolding around them. Trees downed, shop signs torn from their hinges, debris swirling in the air. It was as if the town itself was being torn apart. They were almost halfway across the square when disaster struck. A loud, ear-splitting crack rang out above them, and David looked up just in time to see a massive tree branch come crashing down. He barely had time to react. With a grunt of effort, David shoved Mr. Lewis to the side, both of them falling to the ground just as the branch smashed into the pavement where they had stood moments before. David's heart pounded in his chest. They had narrowly avoided being crushed, but there was no time to dwell on it. The storm wasn't letting up, and they still had a long way to go. He pulled Mr. Lewis back to his feet, the old man's body now limp with exhaustion. David knew they couldn't stop again. They had to reach shelter, or they wouldn't make it. With every ounce of strength he had left, David pushed forward, dragging Mr. Lewis with him as they battled through the wind and rain. The hardware store was just ahead. Its doors shut tight, but David knew the owner always left a spare key under the flower pot near the entrance. He prayed it was still there. When they finally reached the store, David fumbled with the flower pot, his hands trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. He found the key and quickly unlocked the door, pulling Mr. Lewis inside just as another burst of wind sent more debris flying past them. They collapsed inside the store, soaked to the bone, and breathing heavily. For a moment, neither of them moved, both too exhausted to do anything but lie there, listening to the storm rage outside. David's mind raced as he looked over at Mr. Lewis, who was lying on the floor, his chest rising and falling slowly. The old man was alive, but barely. They had made it to safety, but David knew this was only the beginning of something much larger. As he caught his breath, David couldn't help but wonder, what had driven Mr. Lewis to stay out in the storm? What was the old man looking for out there, alone in the rain? Little did David know, the answers to those questions would change both of their lives forever. David sat on the cold, cracked tile floor of the hardware store, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The wind outside howled and beat against the windows, sending vibrations through the old building. The lights flickered overhead, and the temperature inside dropped quickly as the storm unleashed its full fury on the town. Despite the chaos raging outside, a thick silence seemed to settle between David and Mr. Lewis, the only sounds coming from the old man's ragged breathing and the rhythmic thud of David's heart in his ears. Mr. Lewis lay on his back, his frail body soaked from the rain, eyes closed, lips moving faintly as though trying to speak. David knelt beside him, wiping the water from his own brow and steadying himself for what came next. He wasn't sure how much longer the old man could last. His skin was pale and clammy, his breaths shallow and uneven. A deep worry gnawed at David. What if the old man didn't survive the night? What if he'd waited too long to help him? David grabbed an old blanket from one of the store shelves and wrapped it around Mr. Lewis' shivering form, hoping to provide some warmth, if only a little. The blanket seemed like a feeble defense against the storm's onslaught, but it was the best David could do. As he crouched beside the old man, David kept urging him to stay awake. "Mr. Lewis, hang in there," David said, his voice gentle but urgent. "I need you to stay with me, okay? We've got you inside now. You're safe." But Mr. Lewis was barely responding. His body, already weakened from years of living alone and battling old age, seemed to have little left to give. David felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He wasn't a doctor, and he had no idea how to revive someone in this condition. But he couldn't leave Mr. Lewis alone. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through to get here. He just had to keep talking, keep the old man connected to the world around him. David leaned in closer, trying to encourage the elderly man to respond. "Just keep breathing, Mr. Lewis. We'll get through this, I promise." Mr. Lewis stirred, his eyelids fluttering as if he were trying to wake from a deep sleep. David held his breath, leaning in even closer to hear what the old man might say. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Lewis' lips parted, and he whispered in a voice so faint that David had to strain to hear it. David. The old man's voice was barely more than a breath. "I'm here, Mr. Lewis. What is it?" David asked, bending down, his ear just inches from the old man's face. For a moment, it seemed like Mr. Lewis was trying to form a coherent sentence, his mouth moving in silence. Then, in the faintest of whispers, words began to emerge, words that David couldn't have expected, words that would send his mind spinning. "Find the key," Mr. Lewis gasped, his voice cracking, each word a monumental effort. "You'll unlock the truth." David's brow furrowed, unsure if he had heard the old man correctly. A key. The truth. What was he talking about? The key, David repeated, trying to understand, his pulse quickening. "What key, Mr. Lewis? Where is it?" Mr. Lewis' eyes flickered open briefly, just long enough for David to see the intensity behind them. He grabbed David's wrist weakly, his grip so frail it was barely a touch. His next words were almost lost in the storm's howling wind outside, but David caught them just in time. "It's buried with the past," Mr. Lewis whispered, his voice growing weaker. "It will change your future." David's mind raced, trying to comprehend the cryptic message. Buried with the past, change his future. What did any of this mean? And why was Mr. Lewis telling him this now on the brink of death, in the middle of a furious storm? Before David could ask another question, Mr. Lewis' grip on his wrist loosened, and the old man's hand fell limply to the floor. His breathing grew even shallower, each breath more labored than the last. The weight of his final words hung heavily in the air, thick with mystery and confusion. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Mr. Lewis, who had now slipped into unconsciousness. The old man's face had relaxed into an unsettling calm, his body still beneath the blanket. Outside, the storm raged on, pounding the town with rain and wind, but inside the small hardware store, the world seemed to stop. David's thoughts raced as he replayed Mr. Lewis' cryptic words over and over in his mind. Find the key. Unlock the truth. Buried with the past. Change your future. What key was he talking about? And what truth could be so important that Mr. Lewis, in his final moments, felt compelled to pass this message on to him? It felt as though the old man had been guarding some great secret, one that he had chosen David, of all people, to unravel. David had known Mr. Lewis only in passing. They weren't family. They weren't even close friends. But here, in this moment, it felt as though Mr. Lewis had placed the weight of his entire life on David's shoulders, trusting him with something important, something life-changing. But what? A wave of confusion swept over David, followed closely by an unsettling curiosity. What had Mr. Lewis meant by the past? Was he referring to his own past, or was there something deeper, something that David wasn't seeing? And why had he chosen this moment, his final breath, to reveal such a mysterious message? David looked down at Mr. Lewis, hoping for any sign of clarity, but the old man remained still, his chest rising and falling faintly. His grip on life was slipping, and David knew he had to act fast if he wanted to save him. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and tried to dial for help, but there was no signal. No surprise, given the strength of the storm outside. The town was likely without power, and there would be no way to reach anyone until the storm passed. For now, all David could do was wait, but his mind wouldn't stop turning. He found himself pacing the small space of the hardware store, glancing occasionally at Mr. Lewis to make sure he was still breathing. The words kept echoing in his head, louder and louder each time. Find the key. Unlock the truth. Buried with the past. Change your future. It was as though the words themselves were unlocking something in David's mind, stirring memories and questions that he hadn't thought of in years. David knew that Mr. Lewis had lived a solitary life on the outskirts of town, but beyond that, he knew little about the man's history. Some folks in town had said that Mr. Lewis used to be a prominent figure in the community, wealthy, respected. But that was a long time ago. David vaguely remembered stories from his own childhood, whispers about how Mr. Lewis had lost everything, though no one seemed to know exactly how or why. Over the years, the old man had faded into obscurity, a forgotten soul in a town that moved on without him. Could Mr. Lewis' cryptic whisper be tied to that lost chapter of his life? Had he been carrying a secret all these years, a truth that was buried along with the remnants of his past? David wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with the information. He felt as if he had been handed a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and the urgency of the moment, Mr. Lewis' condition, the storm outside, only made the mystery more pressing. As David sat back down beside Mr. Lewis, the old man stirred slightly but did not wake. His breathing remained shallow, and his face had grown paler with each passing minute. David reached out and placed his hand on Mr. Lewis' shoulder, a gesture of comfort, though he wasn't sure who it was meant to comfort, Mr. Lewis or himself. "You're going to be okay," David whispered, though he wasn't sure if the old man could hear him. "We're going to figure this out." And though David spoke with conviction, deep down, he knew that whatever Mr. Lewis had just told him was only the beginning of a much larger journey, a journey that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, but David was already planning his next steps. He needed to uncover the meaning behind Mr. Lewis' final words, and he knew that whatever the old man had buried with his past was the key to understanding everything. After what seemed like an eternity, the storm finally subsided, leaving Maple Creek battered but standing. The winds that had howled through the town died down, and the rain, once relentless, dwindled to a soft drizzle. The hardware store had provided David and Mr. Lewis with a makeshift shelter, but the urgency of the situation hadn't passed. Mr. Lewis' breathing had become weaker, and his skin was growing colder by the minute. David knew that if he didn't get help soon, the old man might not make it through the night. As soon as the winds had calmed enough to allow safe travel, David scrambled to find a way to call for help. Miraculously, the power flickered back on in parts of the town, and David managed to get a weak signal on his cell phone. He dialed the emergency number, his hands trembling as he spoke to the dispatcher. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, lights flashing, but the sirens muted in the stillness that followed the storm. Paramedics rushed inside and assessed Mr. Lewis. They carefully loaded the old man onto a stretcher, securing him as David followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over him, a feeling that Mr. Lewis' time was running out. As they carried Mr. Lewis into the ambulance, David hesitated. He didn't know what to do, whether to follow the ambulance to the hospital or return to his own life. But the memory of Mr. Lewis' cryptic whisper echoed in his mind, anchoring him to the spot. "Find the key, unlock the truth, buried with the past." The words had taken root in David's thoughts, like a puzzle he was now compelled to solve. Before he could decide what to do, the ambulance roared away, leaving him standing alone in the aftermath of the storm. Maple Creek, though shaken by the storm, began its slow recovery. Neighbors emerged from their homes, checking on each other and assessing the damage. The streets were littered with fallen branches, debris, and scattered belongings. The town had weathered storms before, but this one had been different. This one felt like it had left a scar, an unshakable reminder that nature's fury could strike at any moment. David spent the rest of the night in a fog, barely sleeping as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see Mr. Lewis' pale face and hear the whispered words. What did the old man mean? What key? And what truth had been buried with the past? David felt a strange pull, a responsibility that went beyond simple curiosity. Mr. Lewis had chosen him to carry this message, and he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, David tried to return to his usual routine. He opened the mechanic's shop as he always did, but everything felt off. His heart wasn't in his work, and his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Lewis, his employees, Mike and Terry, noticed the change in him. They asked if everything was all right, but David brushed off their concerns with a tight-lipped smile, telling them he was just tired from dealing with the storm. But the truth was, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to do something important. As he worked on the cars in the shop, his thoughts were consumed by Mr. Lewis and the mystery he had left behind. Should he focus on his job, on his responsibilities to his business and his family, or should he pursue the riddle Mr. Lewis had handed him? He felt torn, like he was standing at a crossroads. That evening, as David sat at his kitchen table, the phone rang. His stomach clenched as he answered, knowing instinctively that the news wouldn't be good. It was the hospital. "Mr. Martinez," the voice on the other end said softly, "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Arthur Lewis passed away earlier this afternoon. His condition deteriorated overnight, and despite our best efforts, we were unable to stabilize him." David's heart sank. He had expected it, but hearing the words made it real. Mr. Lewis was gone, and with him, any chance of getting a clear explanation for the cryptic message he had whispered in his final moments. But now, the words took on even more weight. Whatever Mr. Lewis had meant, it was something he had wanted David to discover, something he had trusted him to uncover. The whisper wasn't just a passing thought, it was a dying man's last plea. David hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. He felt a mix of sadness, confusion, and a strange sense of duty. The responsibility now rested squarely on his shoulders. Whatever truth Mr. Lewis had hinted at, it was up to David to find it. David spent the next few days consumed by the mystery. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't think of anything else but the old man's final words. He knew he needed to find out more about Mr. Lewis' past, what key he had been referring to and why it was so important. But where to start? Mr. Lewis had lived a quiet, almost invisible life in Maple Creek. Few people knew much about him, and those who did had long since forgotten the details. David began by asking around town, talking to anyone who might have known Mr. Lewis in his younger years. He learned that Mr. Lewis hadn't always been the lonely figure feeding birds in the town square. Decades ago, he had been a prominent businessman in Maple Creek, a man of influence and wealth. He had owned a large estate on the outskirts of town and had been deeply involved in the local community. People had once looked up to him as a pillar of the town, a man who seemed to have it all. But then, something had happened. Somewhere along the way, Mr. Lewis had lost everything: his fortune, his family, his reputation. The details were vague, but the general story was that Mr. Lewis had been involved in some kind of financial scandal that had ruined him. His business had collapsed, and shortly after, his family had left town. Some said his wife had died, while others whispered that she had abandoned him in his darkest hour. Either way, Mr. Lewis had been left alone, a shadow of his former self, and had slowly faded into obscurity. David couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he listened to the townspeople recount these stories. Like most people in Maple Creek, he had never paid much attention to Mr. Lewis. The old man had become part of the background, a fixture in the town square that everyone passed by, but no one really saw. But now, David realized that Mr. Lewis had been carrying the weight of some great secret all those years, a truth that he had taken to his grave. But there was one person who might know more, an old friend of Mr. Lewis who still lived in town. Her name was Mrs. Clara Watson, a retired librarian who had known Mr. Lewis during his better days. David decided to pay her a visit. Mrs. Watson lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by a garden filled with blooming flowers and creeping vines. When David knocked on her door, she answered with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "David Martinez, isn't it?" she said, ushering him inside. "I heard about what you did for Arthur during the storm. Poor man. I'm so sorry to hear he's gone." David thanked her and took a seat in her cozy living room. After exchanging pleasantries, he explained why he had come. He told her about the cryptic message Mr. Lewis had whispered to him, about the key and the truth buried with the past. Mrs. Watson listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When David finished, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Arthur was a complicated man," she said softly. "He made mistakes, big ones, but I don't believe he was ever a bad person. He was just lost. After the scandal, after his family left, he became a recluse. He was consumed by guilt, I think, but I never knew exactly what he was hiding." David leaned forward, sensing that Mrs. Watson knew more than she was letting on. "Do you have any idea what he might have meant by the key?" he asked. Mrs. Watson was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant, as if she were remembering something long forgotten. Finally, she spoke. "There was a rumor," she said slowly. "Years ago, after everything fell apart, people whispered that Arthur had hidden something valuable. But no one ever found anything. If there was a key, I suspect it might lead to whatever it was he hid all those years ago." David's mind raced. Could this be the key Mr. Lewis had mentioned? Had he hidden something, money, documents, or perhaps something more symbolic, that could explain the mystery surrounding his downfall? Mrs. Watson stood and walked to a small bookshelf in the corner of the room. She pulled out an old weathered journal and handed it to David. "This belonged to Arthur," she said. "He gave it to me for safekeeping years ago. I think he knew that one day someone would come looking for answers." David took the journal, feeling its worn leather cover beneath his fingertips. Inside, he knew, was the next piece of the puzzle. Whatever Mr. Lewis had hidden, whatever truth he had taken to his grave, it was now up to David to uncover it. David left Mrs. Watson's house with the old journal clutched tightly in his hands. His mind swirled with questions and possibilities, but one thing was clear. This journal was the key to unlocking Mr. Lewis' secret. As he drove back home, he couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Watson had told him. A hidden fortune. A betrayal. It seemed unbelievable, but the weight of the journal in his hands made it real. Once he was back in his small, cluttered living room, David sat down at the kitchen table and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. At first, the entries seemed normal, mundane notes about daily life, small business dealings, and family matters. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone of the entries changed, becoming more frantic, more secretive. About halfway through the journal, David found the first real clue. Mr. Lewis had written about a business deal gone wrong, about how he had been betrayed by someone close to him, his own son, James. According to the journal, James had stolen a large sum of money from the family business, money that was supposed to be for an investment that would secure their financial future. Instead, James had secretly siphoned off the funds for his own personal gain, leaving the company to collapse and his father to take the blame. Mr. Lewis had covered up the betrayal to protect his family's reputation, but the damage was done. His business fell apart, his fortune disappeared, and his wife left him, taking what little was left of their assets. The journal painted a heartbreaking picture of a man trying to hold his life together, only to watch it unravel due to the treachery of his own flesh and blood. But what caught David's attention most was a series of cryptic entries toward the end of the journal. Mr. Lewis wrote about a key, an actual physical key that was tied to something he had hidden away. The words were vague, but they suggested that this key held the final piece of the puzzle, something that could explain the full extent of the betrayal and perhaps recover what had been lost. One entry stood out in particular. "The truth is buried with the past, but I left the key with my father. It will open the door to everything. What was taken from me, and what I couldn't reclaim in life. The key lies in the old family cemetery, where it all began." David's heart raced as he read those words. He knew what he had to do. Later that night, after the sun had set, and the town of Maple Creek had grown quiet once again, David found himself standing at the gates of the old family cemetery. The air was cool, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the gravestones. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, a place David hadn't visited since he was a child, and it had an eerie stillness to it, as if it were waiting for him. David had brought a small shovel, a flashlight, and the journal. He had memorized the section about the location of the key. It was buried near the tombstone of Mr. Lewis' father, a man David had never known but whose name had come up multiple times in the journal. According to the notes, Mr. Lewis had placed something important beneath the grave, something that held the truth about his downfall. As he stepped through the iron gates, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel echoed through the otherwise silent cemetery. The tombstones loomed like forgotten memories, each one a reminder of the town's past. David's breath came in shallow, nervous gasps, but his curiosity drove him forward. He followed the narrow path until he found the Lewis family plot. A cluster of weathered headstones, their inscriptions barely visible in the dim moonlight. There at the center was the tombstone of Mr. Lewis' father, John Lewis. The stone was worn, but the name was still legible. David's hands trembled as he set down the flashlight and began digging. The earth was cold and soft, and with each shovelful of dirt, David felt as if he were unearthing more than just soil. He was unearthing the secrets of an old man's life. After several minutes of digging, the shovel hit something solid. David's heart pounded in his chest. He knelt down, brushing the dirt away with his hands until he saw it, a small rusted box buried just beneath the surface. His fingers shook as he pulled it out of the ground. The box was old, its hinges creaking as he pried it open. Inside, lying amidst the dirt and decay, was an old rusted key. David held the key in his hand, his mind racing with the implications. This was it, the key that Mr. Lewis had mentioned, the key that would unlock the truth. But before he had time to process what he had found, a sound behind him made him freeze. Footsteps. David spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. A shadowy figure emerged from behind one of the nearby tombstones, stepping into the moonlight. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark coat, and moved with a quiet confidence that made David's stomach churn with unease. As the figure stepped closer, David recognized the face, though it had been years since anyone in Maple Creek had seen him. It was James Lewis, the estranged son who had disappeared from town decades ago after his father's life had fallen apart. His hair was graying now, his features hardened with age, but there was no mistaking the man who had betrayed his father. James stopped a few feet away from David, his eyes locked on the rusted key in David's hand. "I see you found it," James said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "I was hoping you wouldn't, but I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone started digging into my father's past." David's heart raced. He could feel the tension in the air, a dangerous energy that made him grip the key tighter. "What are you doing here?" David asked, his voice steadier than he felt. James took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the key. "I came to make sure this stays buried," he said, nodding toward the small box. "You don't know what you're dealing with. That key unlocks more than just a few old memories. It unlocks something that could ruin everything." David frowned, feeling the surge of anger rising in his chest. "Ruin what? Your father's life is already ruined, and now he's gone. He trusted me with this. He wanted the truth to come out." James' eyes flashed with something dark, fear, perhaps, or maybe regret. "The truth," he scoffed. "The truth is that my father couldn't let go of the past. He was obsessed with it, and it destroyed him. That key unlocks the safe where my father kept all of his documents, the proof of what happened. But if those documents come to light, it's not just me who'll be ruined. There are others involved, people who won't let this go quietly." David's mind raced. He hadn't expected this. What had started as a simple investigation into Mr. Lewis' cryptic whisper had now spiraled into something much larger, something far more dangerous. He could feel the weight of the key in his hand, the enormity of what it represented. James took another step forward, his voice low and threatening. "Give me the key, David. You don't want to be a part of this. Walk away, and no one has to know you were ever involved." David stood his ground, his pulse pounding in his ears. He thought about Mr. Lewis, about the trust the old man had placed in him with his dying breath. He thought about the town, about how people like James had ruined lives without ever facing the consequences. And then he thought about what the truth could mean, what it could change. "I'm not giving you the key," David said firmly. "Your father wanted the truth to come out, and that's what I'm going to do." James' face twisted with anger. For a moment, it looked like he might lunge at David, but instead he sneered and turned away. "You're making a mistake," James said over his shoulder. "You're in way over your head." And with that he disappeared into the shadows, leaving David standing alone in the cemetery, the key to the past clenched tightly in his hand. David sat in his living room, the old rusted key resting on the table before him. He couldn't stop staring at it, as if it might somehow offer him guidance on what to do next. The weight of Mr. Lewis' dying wish hung heavy on his shoulders. The journal, filled with the heart-wrenching story of betrayal, sat beside the key, two relics of a shattered life, tied together by years of secrets and lies. And now David was faced with a decision that felt impossible to make: hand over the key to James, as he had demanded, or expose the truth and risk the consequences. James had made it clear that revealing the truth would bring trouble, not just for him, but for others involved. The way James had spoken, with a quiet, simmering threat, suggested that this was bigger than a father-son betrayal. It was part of something larger, something that could ripple through the town and beyond. Yet, deep down, David knew he couldn't walk away. The memory of Mr. Lewis, frail and broken, whispering those cryptic words in the storm, was seared into his mind. The old man had entrusted him with this secret, believing that David would do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. David wrestled with his conscience. He thought about his quiet life, about how easy it would be to simply return the key to James and move on, leaving the past buried where it was. But then he thought about Mr. Lewis' life, how the old man had suffered in silence, his reputation destroyed, his fortune stolen by his own son. How could David, knowing the truth, stand by and allow James to continue living a lie? The next day, David made up his mind. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant confronting James in public and facing whatever fallout might come. He wasn't going to let the truth die with Mr. Lewis. David called a town meeting, something that hadn't happened in Maple Creek for years. The town square was bustling with whispers and curiosity as people gathered, wondering what could have prompted such an unusual event. Word had already spread about Mr. Lewis' death, and the town was buzzing with speculation about what had really happened. When David stepped up to speak, there was an uneasy hush. He could feel the weight of the town's collective gaze on him. And for a moment, doubt flickered in his mind. But then he saw James standing off to the side, his eyes narrow and cold, and David's resolve hardened. "I called you all here today because there's something important that needs to be said," David began, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "It's about Arthur Lewis." There was a murmur through the crowd. Most of the townspeople barely knew Mr. Lewis, but the few who had watched him decline over the years listened with keen interest. David explained how he had found Mr. Lewis during the storm, how the old man had entrusted him with a final message, a cryptic whisper that led him to uncover a buried secret. He held up the journal, showing it to the crowd. "This is Mr. Lewis' journal. It tells the story of how he lost everything, not because of some business failure or bad decisions, but because he was betrayed by his own son." At that, James stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "That's enough, David," he barked. "You have no idea what you're talking about." But David didn't back down. "I'm afraid I do, James. Your father wrote everything down. He wrote about how you stole the money, how you let him take the blame. This key," David held up the rusted key for the town to see, "unlocks the proof of everything." James lunged toward David, but several townspeople stepped in to hold him back. "You don't understand what you're doing," James spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You're going to ruin lives, David. You're making a mistake." But David met James' gaze with a calm, unshakable resolve. "No, James, the mistake was yours." For a moment, the crowd was silent. Then the whispers started, soft at first, but soon growing louder. People who had once pitied Mr. Lewis, believing him to be a broken, reclusive man who had squandered his life, now saw him in a completely different light. The truth spread through the crowd like wildfire, igniting shock and disbelief. "How could James do that to his own father?" someone whispered. "I knew something didn't add up," said another. "Arthur Lewis was a good man. He didn't deserve this." The more people learned about the betrayal, the more outrage grew. Mr. Lewis had lived in obscurity for so long that most of the town had forgotten about him, forgotten that he had once been a respected figure, a man with a thriving business and a family. Now, as the truth emerged, the town was forced to reckon with the reality that Mr. Lewis had been wronged in the worst way, not by a stranger, but by his own son. James, realizing that the tide had turned against him, slunk away into the crowd, his face pale with fear and anger. For years, he had lived under the assumption that no one would ever uncover the truth. But now, with the journal and the key in David's hands, the truth was finally out in the open. As the meeting came to a close, there was a palpable sense of justice in the air. The town had always assumed that Mr. Lewis was simply a man who had failed, but now they understood that he had been a victim. The revelation sparked conversations about greed, betrayal, and the importance of doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. The following week, David took the key to Mr. Lewis' old office, a small, neglected building on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for years. Inside, he found an old safe, exactly where the journal had said it would be. The safe was covered in dust, its lock rusted with age. David inserted the key, and with a heavy creak, the door swung open. Inside the safe, David found exactly what he had hoped for: documents that proved Mr. Lewis' innocence. There were contracts, financial statements, and letters that detailed the betrayal by James and the subsequent collapse of the family business. It was all there, in black and white, a clear record of what had really happened all those years ago. With this evidence, the town was able to clear Mr. Lewis' name. His reputation, tarnished for so long, was finally restored. For the first time in years, people spoke about Mr. Lewis with respect and sympathy. The old man, who had been forgotten and discarded, was now remembered as a man who had been wronged, but had never lost his dignity. David, having fulfilled his mission, became something of a local hero. People thanked him for bringing the truth to light, for standing up to James, and for giving Mr. Lewis the justice he deserved. But for David, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the right thing, about honoring a man's final wish and ensuring that the truth wasn't buried with the past. David's life was forever changed by the experience. He had always thought of himself as an ordinary man, someone who lived a quiet, predictable life. But through this journey, he had discovered something deeper within himself, a capacity for courage, for standing up when it mattered most, even when the odds were against him. He had learned that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Mr. Lewis had entrusted him with a secret, and David had honored that trust, even when it meant confronting dangerous truths and challenging powerful forces. The town of Maple Creek was also transformed. The story of Mr. Lewis became a symbol of justice and forgiveness, a reminder that sometimes the truth is hidden in the most unexpected places, and it takes courage to uncover it. People in the town began to look out for each other more, realizing that it's easy to overlook those who seem quiet or forgotten. Mr. Lewis' legacy became a lesson in compassion and the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how difficult. As David stood in the town square, looking out at the people who had gathered to honor Mr. Lewis' memory, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done what needed to be done, and in doing so, he had not only changed his own life, but had also brought closure to a man who had been wronged for far too long. Before the meeting ended, David asked the crowd one final question. What would you do if faced with a decision that could change someone's life forever? The question lingered in the air, inviting everyone to reflect on their own choices, their own moments of truth. And as the people of Maple Creek dispersed, David knew that the story wasn't just about Mr. Lewis. It was about all of them. The choices we make, the truths we uncover, and the legacies we leave behind shape the world in ways we can't always foresee.